Welcome to my channel. Please like, subscribe, share. Thank you. The child would have died if Mabel had arrived a few minutes later. That was the thought that stayed in her chest long after the storm had passed, long after the shouting had ended, and long after the palace walls swallowed her into a world she did not belong to. That evening, the rain had been fierce, the sky cracked with thunder, the palace stones were slick with water, and panic had spread through the royal compound faster than fire in dry grass. Servants were running, women were crying. A little girl from the royal family had swallowed a seed and could no longer breathe. Everyone around her had wealth, status, silks and titles, but none of them knew what to do. Mabel did. She did not wait to be invited. She rushed through the back entrance in her soaked clothes, pushed past the crowd, and dropped beside the child. The girl's face had started changing color, and her tiny body was stiff with fear. Mabel acted on instincts, the kind built from a life where excitation often cost too much. She lifted the child and adjusted her grip and forced the obstruction loose. The seed flew out, and the child cried, and the entire room broke open with relief. For a moment, the noise around Mabel became distant. She was breathing hard, water dripping from her braids. Her hands were shaking from the rush of it. The only thing that mattered was the child was alive. Then the room changed, not because the crying stopped, but because power had entered. King Anthony had arrived. Mabel had seen him only from a distance before, the way ordinary people saw men like him, from crowded roadsides, from procession routes, from stories told in markets, but standing in the same room with him was different. He carried the kind of presence that silenced people without effort. He was a man wrapped in wealth, discipline, and quiet exhaustion. He looked at first rescued child, then at Mabel. She could feel the weight of his attention immediately. Not the careless stare of a proud man noticing a poor woman. It was steadier than that, sharper, as if he was trying to understand how someone like her had appeared in the middle of a royal panic and done what nobody else could. Her name was asked. Her background was explained in the small decisive way rich households often explained poor people. She was said to be from the lower town, a helper, a woman who knew herbs and simple remedies. But the king focused on only one fact: she had saved a life. Mabel tried to make things seem ordinary, but everyone in the room knew it was not. Gratitude flooded towards her at once. The child's mother clung to her hand. Palace women suddenly looked at her as though she had risen from the ground, carrying a miracle. Someone wanted to reward her immediately, as if money could wrap up the moment and put it away. Mabel wanted none of it. She wanted to live. She was tired and wet and already too visible. People like her survived by passing through powerful space lightly, not by becoming the center of them. But the king refused to let her walk home in the storm. His kindness was calm, but it was still the kind that expected obedience. That should have been the end of it. It was not. Before arrangements could be made quietly, the Queen Mother appeared. Lady Bernice did not need to raise her voice to remind everyone who she was. She entered with elegance, saw Mabel, and instantly made the room colder. Her disapproval was not loud nor dramatic. It was worse than that. It was refined, controlled, the kind that treated another human being like a stain on polished marble. To her, Mabel was not a brave young woman who had saved a child. She was a wet village girl standing too close to royal comfort. The king insisted that Mabel stay the night in a proper guest room. His mother clearly hated the idea. The disagreement was brief, but its meaning was not. Even in those few moments, Mabel could sense what kind of house this was. Beautiful, powerful, and badly fractured beneath the surface. When the matter was settled, she was led away through long corridors full of polished floors, glowing lamps, and expensive paintings, and the silent weight of old money. Every part of the palace seemed built to remind visitors that they were standing inside history. But to Mabel, it all felt too still, too careful, too rich to be peaceful. The maid assigned to help her was polite but uneasy. She gave Mabel dry clothes, a room, and one quiet warning that stayed in her mind long after the woman had left. This was not a palace where attention came without danger. That truth settled over Mabel the moment she was alone. The room she had been given was larger than the house she had grown up in. The sheets were soft, the air smelled faintly of oil and flowers. The bed itself felt unnatural beneath her body, too gentle for someone used to harder things. But comfort did not bring rest. Her mind kept traveling back home. She thought of the cracked walls of the small house she shared with her mother. She thought of her late sister, whose absence still felt fresh in the corners of that home. She thought of ordinary things, the sound of neighbors, the roughness of old fabrics, the familiar noise of her poor life. None of it was luxurious, but all of it was real. This palace, for all its beauty, felt like a place where people smiled with secrets in their mouths. Sleep would not come. Then, sometime deep in the night, she heard voices in the corridor. At first, she ignored them, but the sound grew sharper and more intense, and curiosity pulled her towards the door. What she heard next was enough to stir her entire body. The conversation was about the throne, about the future, about the growing danger of a kingdom with no heir. Mabel did not need every word to understand the wound at the center of it. It was the same wounds whispered about in markets and behind closed doors, the same shame attached to the king's name like a shadow. King Anthony had no child, no successor, and no secure future, and in a house where power moved through blood, that made him vulnerable in ways wealth could not hide. The man speaking with him was bold enough to mention what many feared but few dared to say openly. People believed something was wrong with King's bloodline. Some called it misfortune, while some called it a curse. Mabel stood frozen behind the half-open door. She had never heard private pain spoken so plainly. When the other man finally left, the king remained alone in the corridor. For the first time that night, he did not look like a ruler. He looked like a man carrying humiliation too heavy to set down. It was then that he noticed her. There was no way to hide. Mabel stepped fully into view, caught between embarrassment and honesty. She had heard too much and both of them knew it. Yet what followed was stranger than anger. The king did not lash out. He did not threaten her. Instead, the moment softened into something quieter, more human. The marks of royalty slipped just enough for her to see the loneliness beneath it. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was the tiredness of a man constantly measured by what he had failed to produce, and Mabel, against her own better judgment, felt for him. That was the danger, not the palace, not the queen mother, not even the rumor-filled halls. The danger was that pity opened a door in her heart that should have remained shut. She had entered the palace as a stranger who saved a child, but before that night ended, she had already seen too much. The crack in the royal family, the quiet humiliation of a powerful man, and the hidden desperation of a throne waiting for an heir. By morning, Mabel would understand one thing clearly. The palace was not simply a rich man's home. It was a battlefield dressed in gold, and without knowing it, she had already stepped into the center of it. By the sunrise, Mabel had already decided she would leave the palace and never return. That decision felt wise while she was still inside the guest room. Before the servant arrived, before the curtains were drawn open to let the morning light play across the polished floors, and before the reality of the palace began pressing itself on her again. In the quiet of dawn, living seemed simple. She had done what fate placed her before to do. She had saved a child. She had spent the night where she never should have been. Now she would go home, return to her own life, and let the palace swallow its secret without her. That was the plan. But plans made in a peaceful room often died the moment real life entered. The morning outside was bright and clean, as if the storm had never happened. The garden shone with fresh rain. The stone walkways glittered in the sun, and the palace had returned to cold beauty of wealth. Servants moved quietly, guards stood tall, beds crossed the sky above carved rooftop and high walls. Everything looked calm, yet beneath the calm, Mabel could already feel tension. It was in the way people looked at her too long before lowering their eyes. It was in the whispers that stopped when she passed. Was in the maid who brought her food but stayed just long enough to study her face with a strange mix of curiosity. News traveled quickly in the rich houses. A poor girl who had saved a royal child during a storm did not remain unknown for long. Maybe dressed in her own clothes again and refused the offer of anything finer. The garments were simple, village made, and still carried the rough honesty of her world. She preferred that. The palace had too much stick already, too much polish and too much hidden meaning in every gesture and substance. When she stepped into the corridor, she expected to be shown the way out. Instead, she was taken to breakfast. That was the first sign the day would not go as she wished. A palace servant explained that the king had requested it, and Mabel nearly refused. But even she knew refusal had limits in a house like this. So she followed, each step tightening the knot in her stomach. The breakfast chamber was grand without being loud, one of those rooms built to remind visitors that comfort itself could turn into power. Tall windows, there were long tables that gleamed, there were fresh foods, wet bread, there were teas and all that. King Anthony was already there. In daylight, he looked different, less shadowed than the man she had seen in the corridor the night before, but no less burdened. He wore a simple but expensive traditional outfit, richly tailored, the kind that carried quiet authority without any need to show off. And his face remained composed. Yet Mabel had already seen enough to know composure was only his armor. He asked that she sit. Mabel obeyed carefully, aware that every movement mattered here. The conversation between them remained light on the surface. He thanked her again for saving his niece. He asked if she had rested. He told her the child was well and laughing already, the fear of the night fading fast from her little body. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a king showing gratitude to a brave stranger. But nothing in the palace was ever that simple. Because before breakfast ended, the Queen Mother entered. Lady Bernice carried mourning grace and elegance, the way soldiers carried weapons. She looked at Mabel, then at her son, and in a single glance made it clear she considered this breakfast an insult to royal order. She did not argue openly. A woman like her understood that direct words was rarely needed when contempt could do the same work more cleanly. Mabel felt it at once. She was not welcome. She finished her meal quickly, lowered her eyes, and prepared herself to leave as soon as palace manners allowed it. Yet, even as she rose from her feet, another pair of eyes had already fixed on her form across the room. It belongs to Lady Celine. She was beautiful in the polished, dangerous way some women became when they had spent years learning how to turn appearance into control. Her skin glowed. Her posture was perfect. And the expensive beaded gown wrapped around her was effortlessly graceful. She was the kind of woman that men noticed and other women studied, but there was no softness in her gaze, only calculations. Mabel did not know her story yet. She only knew instinctively that this was not a woman who liked surprises. And Mabel, without meaning to, had become one. By the time breakfast ended, the palace had fully awakened. Courtyards filled with movement, messengers crossed hallways and advisers arrived. Relatives drifted in and out of private rooms like smoke. Mabel kept her head down and followed the servants leading her towards the main exit. She almost made it, then the screaming began. It came from the woman's wing again, sharp enough to cut through the air. The stop movement all over the corridor. Mabel turned instinctively towards the sound. Before anyone had asked her to, the servant froze. One guard ran and another maid nearly dropped the tray in her hands. Mabel did not think. She ran. By the time she reached the room, confusion had already taken over. A young pregnant woman lay half collapsed on a cushioned seat, her breathing broken, one hand gripping the side of her belly, the other clutching her wrapper. Two maids were near tears. An older woman was praying loudly. Another kept shouting for the palace physician, who had not yet arrived. The pregnant woman's face was pale with pain, too pale. Mabel moved closer and felt it immediately. Something was very wrong, and this was not an ordinary discomfort. The woman's body was tense in a frightening way, as if pain had taken over faster than anyone expected. Sweat covered her skin, and her hands trembled. Her eyes rolled with panic. Mabel knelt beside her, focused, steady, feeling the room blur around her. From the fragments she gathered, the woman was a distant royal cousin, heavily pregnant and not yet due. But the signs before Mabel spoke clearly enough without titles or family lines. The pain had come too hard, too suddenly. There was stains, not a flood, but enough to make her heart sink. The palace physician still had not come, and in the rich houses, delayed help could be just as deadly as no help at all. Mabel ordered clothes, water, space. People obeyed more quickly this time. Fear had already taught them what she could do. She checked what she knew how to check. She calmed what she could calm. She kept the woman from being moved the wrong way. She forced the door room open to let breath enter slowly. But even as she walked, dread spread quickly through her. This was beyond basic care. This woman needed more than panic prayers and waiting. At last, the physician arrived, older, flustered and annoying at being summoned into chaos he could no longer control. But one look at the patient enough to wipe the pride from his face. Orders were given and more servants were called. The woman was carefully prepared to be moved to a private treatment chamber. Only then did the king appear. He entered with the same contained force as before, but this time there was a sharper edge to him. Too much had happened in too little time. First a child choking, now a royal pregnancy under threat. His eyes took in the room, the stain, the woman, the physician, and Mabel. Again, it was becoming impossible to ignore the pattern. Twice in less than a day, disaster had struck in the same palace. Twice, Mabel had been at the center of the response. That did not sit comfortably with everyone. Lady Celine stood near the doorway, dressed beautifully, watching everything with unreadable stillness. The Queen Mother arrived moments later, and the displeasure on her face deepened when she saw Mabel once again inside a crisis that touched royal lineage. Even those who said nothing were thinking about the same thing now. Why was this village girl suddenly everywhere? Mabel could feel suspicion taking shape in the room before anyone spoke it aloud. That was when she knew she was in danger, not because she had done wrong, but because in the houses ruled by power, even usefulness could become threatening. The pregnant woman was eventually stabilized enough to be taken away under the physician's supervision. The child's condition remained uncertain. The woman around her dissolved into worry and tears. The room emptied slowly, but the tension remained. Mabel stood exhausted, her hands unsteady now that the crisis had passed. She had tried to leave. Instead, the palace had pulled her deeper inside itself. King Anthony thanked her again. But gratitude was no longer simple. Too many eyes were watching. Too many minds were already turning. What had seemed like an act of compassion yesterday was beginning to look to some people like a pattern they did not trust. By afternoon, the palace was no longer merely whispering about Mabel. It was discussing her. Some said she was brave, some said she was gifted, some said she had unusual hands, the kind women in old folk tales were said to have, and that arrived at the edge of life and death, as if drawn there by unseen forces. Others were less kind with their words. They asked why trouble seemed to follow her every step. They wondered whether her presence was truly fortunate. Mabel had enough to understand the truth. In one night, she had gone from invisible to dangerous, and nothing was more hated in a rich house than a poor woman who could not be ignored. By evening, the king had made a decision. He did not ask her to stay as a guest anymore. He asked her to remain in the palace for a few more days as a companion and watchful helper around the women's wing until the pregnant royal cousin was stable. It was framed as a perfect practical request, one born from gratitude and caution after two back-to-back emergencies. But everyone knew it was more than that. Keeping Mabel close would calm some fears. It would also create new ones. When the news spread, Lady Benny's disapproval hardened into quiet fury. Lady Celine's expression revealed almost nothing, but her silence itself began to feel deliberate. The servants bowed and obeyed, yet their eyes carried the tree of unfolding drama. The palace, which had already been hungry for gossip, now had a fresh story to chew on. A village woman had entered through the storm. The king had noticed her, and now she was staying. That night, Mabel stood by the small balcony outside her new room, looking over the dark gardens below. She felt something she had tried all day to deny. This was no longer about helping. She had crossed an invisible line the moment King Anthony chose to keep her there. Now she stood there, inside a house where women measure status with smiles, where relatives watch inheritance like hawks, where one unseen weakness in the king had made the entire throne restless. She should have been planning how to escape. Instead, she found herself thinking of his face in the corridor the night before, the loneliness in it, the humiliation he carried quietly, the strange softness that had appeared only when nobody else was watching. That frightened her more than anything. It frightened her more than the palace itself, because she knew how stories like this begin. Not with love, with sympathy, with nearness, with the dangerous mistake of seeing the human being inside a powerful man, and somewhere else in that palace, behind jewels, perfume, smiling mouths, women like Celine were already deciding what had to be done about her. Mabel had survived the storm, but she was beginning to understand that the real storm had only just started. By the third morning, the palace had learned Mabel's name, not because anyone announced it, but because places like this did not need announcement. Information moved through them the way wind moved through dry leaves, quiet, quick, and impossible to stop. By the time the sun rose over the eastern wall, cooks in the lower kitchens were already discussing her. Stable boys have heard a version of their own stories. The women in the laundry room had begun adding details that never happened, and in the upper rooms, where silk softened every footstep, her name was being spoken more carefully. Mabel Ayo, the girl who arrived in the rain, the girl who saved the king's niece, the girl who was present again when another crisis struck, the girl the king asked to stay, in a house built on status. That last details mattered more than all the rest. Mabel felt the change without anyone needing to explain it to her. It showed in the way conversation slowed when she passed, in how some servants now bowed a little deeper, unsure whether she had become someone important overnight, in how others avoided her eyes entirely, as if promiscuity alone might draw trouble towards them. She did not like any of it. Visibility was not safety. Visibility was risk. That morning she was assigned a smaller room to the women's wing, not as grand as the guest room she had first slept in, but still far above anything she had known. The air inside carried the scent of polished wood and faint incense. A small carved stool sat near the window. A basin of water had been prepared for her already. Fresh clothes had been offered again. She refused them again, not out of pride, but out of instincts. Changing into palace clothing would not just alter how she looked, it would blur the lines between who she was and where she stood, and Mabel needed that line clear. She washed her tied wrapper neatly, adjusted her beads, and stepped out into the corridor. The palace was already alive. Servants moved with quiet efficiency. Distant voices rose, fell in controlled tones. Guards stood at intervals, unmoving as curved figures. The morning light filtered through tall openings and reflected softly against smooth stones, turning everything warm without making it gentle. Maybe I had grown up in a world where mornings were loud. Roosters, cooking fires, chatter, movement here. Morning felt measured. Everything had a place. Everything had a rhythm. Even urgency were more disciplined. She followed the direction given to her the night before and made her way towards the women's wing. That was where she was needed now. That was where the palace watched most clearly and closely. The pregnant royal cousin, Lady Ireti, had survived the crisis of the previous day, but her condition remained uncertain. The palace physician had ordered rest, constant monitoring, and minimal stress. It was clear from the tension in the air that this pregnancy mattered more than anyone wanted to say out aloud. Mabel understood why. In a house where the king had no heir, every womb would become political. When she entered the Ireti's chambers, the atmosphere was thick with concern. Two attendants stood quietly near the bed. Another sat grinding herbs in a small mortar. The physician's instruction had been written down and placed on a nearby table, as if written words might enforce control over something far more fragile. Lady Letty lay propped up against a cushion and her face was still pale. Her strength was not fully returned, but her eyes were open and aware and searching. They found Mabel's quickly. Recognition passed between them, followed by something softer, gratitude without noise. Mabel moved closer, checking what needed to be checked, observing more than speaking. She adjusted the arrangement of clothes. She asked for water. She studied the patient's breathing pattern. The tension in her body, the small signs that revealed more than any spoken description. She had no title, no official training by palace standards, but she knew what she was doing. And the woman in the room knew it too. For the first time since she entered the palace, Mabel felt something settle slightly into place. Not comfort, not belonging, but purpose. In that room, her presence made sense. Her hands were not out of place. Her knowledge was not questioned. That was dangerous in its own way. But because youthfulness could become dependence, and dependence could become power. The morning passed quietly. No crisis came, no sudden change. Just careful attention, small adjustments, and the slow rhythm of watchfulness. Lady Reti drifted in and out of rest, and the attendants moved softly outside the chambers. Life continued as it could, but Mabel felt something building. Not an event, a shift. It came first as a feeling, then as a pattern. Footsteps outside that paused longer than necessary. Conversations that dropped when she approached. A servant who entered the room twice without reason, as if searching for something unseen. By midday she understood. She was not simply being observed, she was being studied. That realization tightened something in her chest. She had seen it before, in smaller ways, in smaller places. The way people watched when they did not trust what they did not understand. But here the watching carried more weight, more consequences, and suspicious. It turned into action. The first real sign of that action came in the afternoon, as Mabel had stepped out briefly to fetch fresh herbs and fresh water. When she crossed paths with Lady Celine, there was no crowd around her this time, no audience, no need for performance. She stood alone near one of the inner corridors dressed in a deep-toned beaded gown that caught the light with every slight movement. But her eyes were not calm. They were focused. Mabel felt it immediately. The difference between being looked at and being assessed. She lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but out of awareness. This was not someone to challenge without reason. Lady Celine took a few steps closer. Not too close enough. The air between them felt measured, carefully controlled, as Mabel sensed that this moment had been chosen, not accidental, not casual. The silence stretched just long enough to make its presence felt before Lady Celine finally spoke, not with aggression, not with hostility, but with a softness that carried edge between it. She welcomed Mabel to the palace. She acknowledged what had happened over the past days. She mentioned how quickly Mabel had become known. The words felt polite. The tone was smooth, but the meaning beneath them were clear. You have been seen, and being seen comes with consequences. Mabel answered simply, respectfully, and carefully. She did not offer more than necessary. She did not shrink, but she did not stand too tall either. There was a balance to survival in the palace like this. Too much presence could invite attack, and too little could invite dismissal. Lady Selene watched her response closely. Not the words, the space between them, the pauses, the posture, the breathing. It was not a conversation, it was an evaluation. After a few moments, Lady Selene stepped back. The faintest shift of expression passing across her face, something unreadable and something unfinished. Then she left, just like that, no warning, no threat. And that was what made it dangerous. Because silence in a house like this often meant planning. Maybe stood there a moment longer than necessary before moving again. Her grip on the water vessel tightened slightly. She did not need anyone to explain what had just happened. The palace had made its first move. The rest of the day passed without visible disruption. Lady Ireti remained stable. The physician visited again, his manner more controlled now, and his confidence restored by time. The attendants continued their duty, and the corridor remained filled with unusual quiet movement of the palace. But beneath it all, something had shifted, and Mabel could feel it in the way certain doors closed when she approached, in how certain lingered just a second longer than before, in how information seemed to move faster around her than she could follow. By evening, the palace felt different, as if something invisible had begun to circle. That night, Mabel found herself once again unable to sleep. Not because of the room, not because of the bed, but because her mind refused to rest. She sat near the window looking out over the darkened gardens. The air carried the soft scent of warm earth and wet earth. The palace never truly slept. It only quieted. A knock came at her door, soft, controlled, and deliberate. Mabel's body tensed instantly. No one knocked casually at this hour. She stood slowly, walked to the door, and paused, then opened it. A palace servant stood there, head slightly bowed, eyes careful. He delivered a message. The king wished to see her now. Mabel felt the shift again. The same one she had felt earlier with Lady Selene, but stronger and more direct. This was not coincidence. This was movement. She stepped out into the corridor, closing the door behind her. As she followed the servant through the quiet halls, one thought settled firmly in her mind. She had entered the palace as a stranger. She had stayed as a helper, but now she had become, or she was becoming, something else. And in a house built on power, bloodlines, and hidden agendas, becoming something else was the most dangerous thing of all. The walk to the king's chambers felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of weight. Mabel followed the servant through corridors that had grown quieter with the hour. Lamps burned low, shadows stretched across polished floors. The palace, which carried controlled life during the day, now felt like something else entirely at night, watchful, patient, and listening. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into something she did not yet understand. She kept her posture steady and her breathing even, but inside her thoughts were moving fast. Why now? Why at this hour? And why her? They stopped outside a set of large carved doors. The servant stepped aside, bowed slightly, and gestured for her to enter. Mabel hesitated for only a second before she pushed the door open. The room beyond was wide, but not overwhelming, unlike the rest of the palace, which often displayed wealth loudly. This space carried a quieter authority. Everything was deliberate. There were deep wooden tones, soft and lightly. King Anthony stood near a long table, not seated, not relaxed, waiting. He turned as she entered. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There were no guards inside, no attendants, no witnesses, just the two of them. That alone was enough to make Mabel aware that this was not a simple meeting. She moved forward slowly and stopped at a respectful distance. He studied her, not the way others had, not with suspicion, not with calculation, but with something closer to curiosity, as if he was still trying to understand how she had entered his world so suddenly, and why she had entered and stayed. He acknowledged the late hour not as an apology but a necessity. There were things he said that could not be spoken during the day. That told Mabel everything she needed to know. This was not about gesture or gratitude anymore. This was about truth. He asked her how Lady Ireti was. Mabel answered carefully, giving only what was needed. Stable, but not out of danger. The king listened closely, observing every detail. It was clear the situation mattered to him more than formality allowed him to show. The room grew quieter, the kind of quiet that came when conversations moved away from safe ground. He began to speak again, not as a king, but as a man carrying something heavy. He spoke of the palace, of how it appeared strong from the outside, and how fragile it truly was. He spoke of pressure, of expectations, of the way people looked at him not for who he was, but for what he had to give or he had failed to give them. And the word was not spoken often, but it sat between them, unavoidable. Mabel listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer comfort too quickly. She had learned long ago that some pain did not need immediate fixing. It needed to be seen first. And that was what she did. She saw him. Not the crown, not the title, the man. That was the moment everything shifted. Because being seen by the wrong person at the wrong time could change everything. The king noticed it too. Not in words, in stillness, in the way the space between them no longer felt formal. He moved slightly, resting one hand on the table, his shoulder loosened just enough to show the exhaustion beneath his control. He told her something then, something that did not belong to public knowledge. Years ago, before his marriage had ended, there had been attempts, many of them, to secure an heir. Physicians had been consulted, rituals had been suggested, treatments had been tried, but nothing had worked. At some point, the conclusion had been accepted, quietly and firmly. He could not father a child. The palace had adjusted around that truth, but truth in palace like this was rarely simple. There had always been doubts, small at first, then growing. Different physicians giving different opinions and different whispers moving through different corners. Some believed the issue had never truly been confirmed. Others believed something had been hidden. The problem was no one had ever proven anything. And in the absence of proof, rumor became reality. Mabel felt the weight of it settle deeper. This was more than a personal pain. It was a weakness, a visible crack in the foundation of power. And in a house like this, cracks were haunted, used, expanded. The king did not ask for her opinion, but he watched her as if he expected one. Maybe choose her word carefully, not soft, not harsh, true. She spoke of what she had seen in her own life, of how sometimes what people accepted as final was built on incomplete understanding, of how fear and pride could stop people from questioning the wrong conclusion. She did not tell him he was wrong. She did not tell him he was right either. She told him certain things were still and existed. And uncertain meant possibility. The king straightened a little, not with hope, but with attention. It had been a long time since anyone had ever spoken to him without an agenda, without fear, without trying to position themselves in his favor. Mabel was not trying to gain anything. That made her dangerous and valuable. At the same time, the conversation moved slowly after that, more carefully, more aware. They spoke of smaller things, safe things, but the connection had already shifted. Something had been opened, and neither of them could close it completely. At last, the king dismissed her, not abruptly, not coldly, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the night had gone far enough. Maybe bowed slightly and turned to leave. But as she opened the door, she felt it again, that pull, that awareness. She turned back just once and their eyes met. And in that moment, something passed between them that neither of them named. Not love, not yet, but something that could become it. That was the danger Mabel left. The corridor outside felt colder than before, longer, quieter. As she walked back towards her room, her thoughts were now no longer calm. She had crossed the line, not physically, not openly, but something had shifted. And she had shown him too much. And she had seen too much. She reached her door and stepped inside, closing it behind her. For a long time she stood still, then she exhaled slowly, trying to return to the version of herself that existed before this night. But it was already gone. Because somewhere else in the palace, Lady Celine was awake and she had already been informed, not of the full conversation, not of the details, but of the only thing that mattered. Mabel had been summoned at night, alone, to the king's private chamber. That was enough. Lady Celine stood near her own window, looking out into the darkness with a calm expression that revealed nothing. But inside, something had sharpened. This was no longer curiosity. This was confirmation. The village girl was not leaving. And if she stayed, she would grow. And if she grew, she would threaten everything. Lady Celine turned away from the window slowly, her mind already moving ahead, planning, measuring, and deciding. She did not act out of anger. She acted out of strategy. And strategy required timing, precision, and patience. Maybe I did not know it yet, but she had just stepped into a game she did not understand. A game where smiles hide knives, where kindness could be used as bait, where truth could be twisted into accusation, and where survival depends not only on what you did, but on what others believed you had done. Back in her room, Mabel finally lay down, but the sleep could not come. The palace was no longer just watching her, it was moving around. And the storm she had sensed from the beginning was finally beginning to take shape.